Ever since early American history, there has been evidence of those who may have been different from those deemed normal, but many did not know why they were like that and what to do with them. Also, while there have been gradual developments in the treatment of the mentally ill in society over American history, certain implications still remain prevalent in today's society. In the 1600s, many Christian Americans believed that those who were mentally ill were only that way due to some kind of action that they must have done. These illnesses were seen as punishments from God, and at some point they were also seen as demonic possessions. Mentally ill people were put into institutions like jail, and people placed in these institutions were not often given the opportunity to leave, as some of the treatments in these places were cruel and inhumane, and because people were just locked away, the issue of mental illness was not really prevalent in society and people just ignored it. In the beginning of the 1800s, people started to wonder what would cause the mentally ill to be the way they are. And it wasn't until that the early 1830s and 40s, a woman who went by the name of Dorothea took a job teaching at the incarcerated jail at an East Cambridge prison. Treatment there for the people was inhumane and terrible, and she decided that she would step up and lobby for their improving conditions. She observed that violent criminals were being housed together with the mentally ill as well. The imprisoned and the insane had been flogged, starved, chained, physically and sexually abused by their keepers, and left naked and without heat or sanitation. And she also said that the people there were confined in this commonwealth in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, and pens, chained, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She began touring prisons, workhouses, and private homes in an attempt to gather as much evidence for this mistreatment as possible.
Once she presented her findings to legislatures, fundings were given in order to create better housing and new institutions for them. Over the next 4 decades, she advocated to create 32 mental asylums to prevent the cruel treatment of the mentally ill. Dorothea believed that staying at an asylum located in calming areas for approximately 3 to 4 months would eventually cure a person.
It might be actually helpful for them to get away from the pressures and stress of society and be someplace. These places were usually in isolated places that were kind of idyllic, like it was like a spa cure in some ways, that you would go to some really nice place and sit around and nature and like have massages and stuff like that. So I guess for that it could be very therapeutic. If somebody was like actively psychotic, with schizophrenia, for example, it's not really going to affect their symptoms, whether they're at home in a city or away in this like isolated place, that much.
However, many failed to respond to this moral therapy and were kept in custody for so long that they died there. In addition to this, she worked with Dr. Galt, who tried to advocate for the mentally ill and said that they too had dignity. Dr. Galt also brought forth the idea of using drugs to help them and also introduced the idea of talk therapy. Moral treatment focused on keeping the patients busy and letting them live the life they were accustomed to before they were put into institutions. The more useful you were around the institution, or if you caused no trouble, staff was good to you. But if you were disruptive and uncooperative, staff would not be so nice. Such disruptive patients would often be placed in separate buildings. But often, these moral treatments were not adopted into state institutions. Conditions here rapidly declined due to overcrowding and underfunding. Even though there were differences in the public and private hospitals, there were other issues as well. Hundreds of thousands of people were still in jails. Also, state hospitals often functioned as storehouses for the incurable as opposed to productive treatment centers. The decline of moral treatment began in the 1850s. Even the recovery rates of the best private hospitals were dropping. State hospitals also were not the cheapest way to treat patients, as many people required lifetime care. Also, new quarters had to be built due to the high, unpredicted influx of patients. Restraints and harsh treatments were reintroduced into the system as problems kept rising. And states created laws to assure that all dangerous people were to be kept in institutions. In order to prevent escape, institutions had to employ harsh methods which really deprived the patients of their freedoms. Treatment and minimal conditions in the hospital were terrible. There was often not enough food, blankets, or clothing, and many people got frostbite in the winter. In the second half of the 19th century, chronic patients were the majority. Since treatment was not good, the number of incurables was on the rise. Mentally ill people were seen as a never-ending expense instead of people, and this attitude made patient abuse easy. Along with the harsh treatment, tens of thousands of experiments to try to figure out cures were being performed on the helpless patients. These experiments ranged anywhere from lobotomies to electroshock therapies that continuously left patients more damaged than before. And sometimes doctors wouldn't even realize that they were hurting so many people.
There are also people who, um, you know, have their own psychological issues going on, who are mental health practitioners, and so they might really believe themselves that they're doing the right thing, but they're doing something that's detrimental to their patients, but it's like sort of self-promoting or self-aggrandizing. For example, there was this guy, Walter Freeman, who is like, he's kind of infamous in mental health. He was a very well-renowned psychiatrist who pioneered this lobotomy procedure where they used an ice pick and they went up through the orbital socket and like messed up, scrambled like parts of the brain. And he performed like thousands of before people finally stopped him and said like, this is ridiculous. But I mean, he was like almost like a megalomaniac. If you read like biographies of him and you hear people talk about him, he was very much into being like the guy who everyone turned to for help with that stuff. And it kind of blinded him to the fact that he was really doing more harm than good. So I'm sure that there are people like that, at any given time.
Alongside with Dorothea Dix, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe was also a huge advocate for those who were disabled. He helped establish the Massachusetts School for Idiot and Feeble-Minded Youth. Now keep in mind that back then the word idiot was considered a polite term for those who were mentally and intellectually disabled. Although Dr. Howe was successful in his attempts to educate the mentally disabled, some said that because these students were thriving at these schools, they should permanently reside there. Immediately, Dr. Howe expressed his concern with this and argued that the mentally disabled had rights as well and that segregating them from the rest of society would be extremely detrimental. In 1866, he gave a speech to an audience warning them about the dangers of segregating those based on disability. He said, "We should be cautious about establishing such artificial communities for any children and youth, but more especially should we avoid them for those who have natural infirmity. Such persons spring up sporadically in the community, and they should be kept diffused among sound and normal persons. Surround insane and excitable persons with sane people and ordinary influences, vicious children with virtuous people and virtuous influences, blind children with those who can see, mute children with those who can speak, and the like." Around the late 1880s, Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist, was the founder of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was a method for curing psychopathology. Basically, the way it would work was that the doctor would consider the emotional history of each patient and charter in every detail of the patient's history. He had a clinical practice set up in Vienna, and through his discovery of psychoanalysis, he developed therapeutic techniques like free association and transference. Since over time it was seen that people didn't actually recover and places were just getting increasingly crowded, in 1887, Nellie Bly, an American journalist, pretended to be a mentally ill person in order to get the inside scoop at the Women's Lunatics Asylum. Nellie Bly was doing this in order to expose the brutality that had occurred there with impressive acting. She was able to be declared insane and was admitted to the asylum, which makes it seem as if it was a little bit too easy to be
The
admitted.
things she reported seeing were beyond gruesome and inhumane. Dangerous patients tied with rope. Waste was lying everywhere. Rats were scuttling to and from in undrinkable water. People were given minimal clothing and sat on hard benches all day. The water was cold, and buckets of it were poured over their heads when needed to shower.
In fact, in one of her articles she described it as, "My teeth chattered and my limbs were goose-flushed with blue and cold. Suddenly I got, one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water too, into my eyes, my ears, my nose, and my mouth." After her book 10 Days in a Madhouse was published, it exposed the mistreatment at the asylum and therefore prompted public and political action, which led to reform of the institution. Legislations were raised so that budgets could be increased, and also examinations were made to be more thorough so that only those who were actually seriously ill and were meant to be admitted were actually admitted. After the 1920s, the U.S. saw yet again another shift in society's view on mental health. A Mind That Found Itself, a book by Bierce, discusses how mentally ill people were treated in institutions. His ideas began in the room of the National Mental Health Association, and his intent was to improve the lives of the mentally ill through lobbying and research. He was a former patient for about 3 years himself, and he knew what it was like to be instituted, and he wanted to see a change happen. With the National Committee for Mental Health Hygiene being created by him, this foundation allowed grants to be provided for research toward psychiatric disorders and also provided funding for training for medical students. Although there were numerous advancements occurring, whether it was medication-wise or institutions being open, there were still horrible circumstances in these hospitals, even as late as 1945.
And even though ever since Nellie Bly the government said that there would be increased examinations to see who should really be admitted and who doesn't need to, Ezra Pound was an example of a flaw in the system. Ezra Pound was an American who was arrested in Italy for treason towards the U.S. in 1945. He was then tried for treason in Washington, D.C., but he was found to be insane on purpose by his lawyer, so was then directed to the St. Elizabeth Hospital. While in the hospital, he describes it as a hellhole and a place where there are no windows, thick steel doors, and little peepholes that allow the doctors to look through in order to observe the patients. In addition, he talks about how there are patients running around with frothing in their mouths. Institutionalizing people provided relief for people struggling to care for the mentally ill, but in the late 1950s, people started deinstitutionalizing to get rid of the asylum-based system. During this time, new pills were also becoming available for treatment, and the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 closed state institutions, and strict standards were put in place specifying who was sick enough to be institutionalized. By the mid-1960s, most people were moved from large state institutions into smaller, more local homes. In the 1950s, there were around 560,000 people in institutions, and by 1980, it was about 130,000. While the issue of deinstitutionalizing is not really an issue, some people say that at home, the mentally ill do not have the necessary medical care that they would receive in an institution. Taking people out of institutions puts the burden on families, and many can't even really afford proper care.
One of the reasons these places were isolated off in the middle of nowhere, though, is because sometimes it was like a way for the family to get rid of that person. So symptoms can be very distressing to the people around them. So if someone was psychotic and was hallucinating and ranting and being delusional, it was very disturbing to be around that, and it helped the family if you could put that person out of sight, out of mind for a while. But it didn't really help their symptoms. You could make the case that it gave the family a reprieve to take a breather and get their sort of restore their own resources of energy and support and stuff like that, so that when the person came home, they had more sort of emotional resources themselves to help and to deal with it.
And as the asylum system was coming to a close, many of the mentally ill found themselves out on the streets, homeless, with no family or friends to turn to. And the one thing they did turn to was drugs and alcohol, which eventually would also lead them to be violent. And when they were violent, they would also end up in prison, to the point where many people in prison were actually considered mentally ill.
The mayor's plan focuses on what officials say is a narrow segment of the homeless, the mentally ill who are violent. A $22 million effort will fill 3 mobile treatment units to service 75 people, establish other treatment teams to handle 272 who have violent behavior, send more cops to police areas around shelters, and increase the number of peace officers inside shelters.
I think this is a plan that will have a big impact over time.
The plan unveiled today is part of a larger program to deal with the mentally ill. Arrival date sometime in the fall. At City Hall, I'm Marcia Kramer, CBS 2 News.
In addition to the mayor's $22 million homeless plan, President Obama also began to support the idea of the mental health parity, where private insurance companies would have to provide coverage for the mentally ill, something that wasn't easily accessible before.
With these acts aside, in terms of the mentally ill who were in jail, let's say there was a patient who was violent and had a case against them. If the jail tries to prepare them for the trial, it gives them confidence to try to defend themselves, because if they lose the case, then they would be transferred to an actual prison where they can't receive any help. Finally, President Obama also unveiled a $4 trillion budget proposal for 2016, and inside that budget, it included a number of important proposals for agencies and programs of importance to people living with serious mental illnesses and their families. In a surprise development, the budget proposed to eliminate the unfair 190-day lifetime limit on inpatient psychiatric care in the Medicare program. And finally, in conclusion, although there have been many slow and gradual developments since the 1600s in America, there still has been some type of improvement towards the mentally ill, and hopefully there will continue to be in the near future.
Whether it's by eventually creating new medications and drugs to further help them, or even find a cure, or even to find a way to get as many homeless off the streets as possible. It may be a slow and gradual process, but have faith that it'll all be